Well, good morning. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending Best Practices and, of course, virtual conference. What it wouldn't be like without some tech difficulties. So thank you very much for finding your way over to our social emotional learning portion here. So good morning, my name is Ann Hockett. I'm a faculty member at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point in the School of Education, and I am overjoyed to have Dr. Paul Wright and Dr. Kevin Richards with us today. They are some of the leading researchers in physical education and specifically social emotional learning in physical education. Dr. Paul Wright is from Northern Illinois, and Dr. Kevin Richards is from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. So again, I am, as you can see by their bios, they have extensively studied this topic, and I'm very happy that they can be here today. They have also just co-edited a book entitled Social and Emotional Learning in Physical Education, Applications in School and Community Settings. Paul, do you have that with you by chance? There you go, a little FaceTime for the new book. So this book was published by Jones and Bartlett Learning in cooperation with Shape America, and it is available now for fall. So this is a wonderful text to be used in our teacher education programs and as a resource to focus on social emotional learning within your own K-12 classroom as well. So today's session is not a lecture session, right? I didn't make them make a PowerPoint for you. So today's session is much more conversational. So I just wanted a chance for you to ask questions, to talk to our presenters today, to get a little background information on social emotional learning, how you can apply this into your own classroom. And especially I see a lot of higher educators here on the, joining us today. So how you could incorporate this into your education program as well. So if you have a question, please feel free, you can write it in the chat. I will do my best to monitor the panel and incorporate that into the conversation. Of course, if I am missing you for some reason, please, you know what, just unmute and join the conversation. Pretty informal that way. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Dr. Paul Wright and Dr. Kevin Richards.
Thank you, Ann. Thanks so much for having us here today and giving us a chance to talk to this group. This is a great way to, when you put all the work, the time and effort into producing a book, you don't know where it's going to go, who's going to take it up, or, what impact it'll have. So it's really nice for us to be able to talk to practitioners, people working with kids out in the schools, and people training folks who will be teachers. To share the ideas and bat things around and try to promote this good work, hopefully.
Yeah, and I would just echo that that this has been a really kind of enjoyable and insightful process for both Paul and I. We learned a ton through the process of pulling together the book, and I would just really reinforce that the book is edited. So Paul and I wrote co-authored about a third of the chapters, and then the other bulk of the book, the other 2/3. We found experts in the field who knew more about those areas than we did. So any accolades or praise for the book really goes to all involved, not just Paul and myself.
Excellent. Thank you very much. So to start off here, why SEL? Why is this such a popular topic in not only education right now, but physical education? Kind of how did we get to this point? And again, I'll leave it open to both of you. You can, duke it out. Who wants to go first?
You want to arm wrestle, Paul?
We've got a pretty dog and pony show here. I'm not going to say who's the dog and who's the pony, but and I usually barge in first. So let's stay true to form. I would say, and this is covered in the book, obviously in the introductory chapters, we sort of set the stage for what do we mean by SEL? Where does that fit into education overall these days? And we do like to start with that really bigger framing. And because I guess this is one thing I've always observed is that physical education tends to follow suit with trends in the broader field, right? Either in the broader field of education or in terms of public health. Usually the large trends, the large pressures out there wind up shaping what happens in education, and then PE is usually lagging a bit behind that. this is an interesting case because the field of education has really taken up the idea of social and emotional learning in the last couple of decades. A lot of people, and I think that I speak for Kevin and I here, believe these are important outcomes in and of themselves. It is just important for a person's holistic development, you know, to learn how to manage and recognize their emotions, how to deal effectively with other people, etc. Plenty of people in education believe that. It's also gained a lot of steam because it's shown to support academic success in schools. I think that's why a lot of educational researchers really got on board with this. Many kids, when they're not doing well in school, it's not about their intellect or their IQ. It's about the fundamentals of being able to manage themselves, being able to focus, being able to stay on task and give their best effort, dealing with issues like motivation and cooperation. Those become big stumbling blocks for kids to succeed in school and for all of us as we bumble through life. So there's just been this growing emphasis on saying, hey, this is good for kids to do well with other content in school. It's important for them to learn and develop on their own. And it's just heightened by all we've seen with increases in mental health problems, depression and anxiety among kids. Those things were already a very troubling trend before COVID came along and exacerbated all of that. So this is a much broader field in our society and in education. And we found that the PE actually has a head start in a lot of ways. Maybe not in terms of how we frame this, but a lot of our best teaching models and best strategies, we've been doing this so well for decades, teaching and developing social and emotional learning, just under various names and in, you know, patches here and there. So I think what Kevin and I tried to do was get all this to sync up, you know, sort of compile and be aware of all the great resources and practices we already have, but think of a way to frame them and be more intentional and effective in the way we promote them. And in doing so, syncing up with where the broader field of education is trying to go.
Excellent, thank you. And again, sorry to interrupt, but those of you just joining us, again, this is not a lecture series. This is more of a conversational tone. So please jump in on the chat with any questions that you have, and or feel free to unmute yourself and join in the conversation. So one of the challenges that I've seen with social emotional learning and SEL is kind of the definition. How do we, people define it in different ways. So what are some of the ideas or concepts that you feel or that you see are central to social emotional learning, especially in physical education?
Paul, maybe I'll jump in on the front end of this one, and then you can clean up the mess that I'm about to make. But from, I guess from my perspective, when I think about social and emotional learning, and Paul, I think, touched on this really well in his answer to the first question, this is not something that's new in physical education. This has been around for a while, going back to the 60s and 70s, and the work of pioneers like Don Hellison and Daryl Siedentop that viewed social aspects as being incredibly important to the physical education, physical activity experience. And so, my starting point for SEL it usually involves the teaching personal and social responsibility model, or TPSR, which kind of has 4 responsibility goals focused on respecting the rights and feelings of others, self-direction, helping others in leadership, and participation and effort. Is that the one I missed, Paul? Yeah. Okay, so those 4, then plus, the 5th goal of being able to transfer those lessons learned to other environments. So that's usually my starting point. But if you line that up next to broader frameworks like the organization CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, they have this framework that kind of outlines their view of social and emotional learning. And there's been some work done that actually maps that, and Paul's been part of this, and we did part of it in the book as well, that maps those goals related to personal and social responsibility to that CASEL framework. There's also been work that's done to map the Shape American National Standards to the CASEL framework. And so I guess what my response would be, Ann, is that yes, there are a lot of different frameworks around. There's a lot of different ways for conceptualizing social and emotional learning, a lot of different language that's used. But when you really kind of sift through all of that and get down to the core of it, you'll see that there's a lot of overlap among these different ways of understanding. And oftentimes I find that they're really saying the same types of things, but just using different language. Paul, anything that you want to add to that? Or
yeah, I think there's nothing to clean up. I mean, I agree. That's a really good way to present it. And we try to state that in the book, that we don't want to get in the business of saying which framework is the best one or the right one. Just as Kevin said, a lot of them are hitting on the same notes. It's just a little different framing. But I will tell you, I also am, a long time, promoter of and user of the TPSR model. And within PE, that's one that resonates with me a lot. And the Castle model that Kevin mentioned is not the only one, but it is one of the frameworks we've decided to work with. And I think it's similar to why I like TPSR. Those approaches tend to really boil it down to very concrete things. And I think this is the way PE teachers tend to think and work generally at their best, is they think in terms of teaching skills, right? I mean, that's where your Kung Fu is the absolute best. How to introduce, break down, teach a skill, how to break it down to critical elements, how to give feedback on how kids are doing with that, how to track progress. We do that in our sleep when it comes to psychomotor skills, but I like TPSR and Castle myself because you can immediately use that same mindset and say, these are just personal and social skills.
Yep.
Yeah.
So the Castle framework, I didn't want to go out on a limb and try to spit out the 5 components. So I did look it up, but it's self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. So those kind of 5 components. And as Paul said, some of the work that I did with one of my doctoral students down in Alabama, and then Paul, her and I wrote a paper about it together that's in Joperd. But we really kind of looked at teaching these different social and emotional skills as skills, or competencies as skills. And so if you think about something like helping others, well, one way that you can help others is to give feedback. So what does that look like for a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old or a high school student to give feedback to somebody else? And so if you break it down at that level and give cues and teaching tips the same way we do when we teach psychometric skills, I think that really helps a lot in terms of helping kids to kind of understand and be able to learn these skills.
Excellent. I really love that you said skills and break it down into skills. I think as physical educators and as pre-service teachers, they have a really hard time, especially with the abstract, more affective domain. And I feel a lot, and please correct me if I'm wrong, like how does SEL and the affective domain kind of go together? And then I believe, hitting on Deb's question as well, then how do we assess this, and how can we teach pre-service teachers to assess this?
I would say, again, think in parallel, right? If you were going to teach a kid the jump shot or the bounce pass, that's not magic, right? It's a skill. You demonstrate it, you explain, you make sure they understand what the ideal performance looks like. You give them some reminders and some cues of what that will, how to achieve that. You let them practice, right? And you give them feedback as they develop that skill. Now think of the way we handle cooperation. We just tell kids cooperate, and then we nail them if they don't meet our expectations. Well, what expectations? We never explained it. We never broke it down, and we kick them out of the game if they're not cooperating or communicating positively. We wouldn't do that if a kid messed up the bounce pass. We wouldn't say, "Give me that ball. You can never do this. This is not for you. You're a loser." But that's what we do with personal and social skills. We don't teach them very often. We just assume kids know what we mean by that. We assume they know what it looks like. We assume they know what we mean by that, and that they've been coached on how to do it well, right? So it's just a flip in mindset. Every PE teacher out there knows how to teach a skill and how to do it in a way that sets up a fair, meaningful assessment, right? It would flow right from those critical elements. You do formative, you do summative, all that jazz fits. You just have to flip your mindset to think of these things as skills that you need to teach the kids and help them develop, not just put a poster on the wall and say, set goals, be a leader, cooperate. That's not teaching. You wouldn't do that with jump shot, bounce pass.
Yeah, this was actually a really big, like, transformative moment for me in the writing of the book. Because, you know, when I went through my teacher education program, we talked about the division between the managerial and the instructional task system. And I remember a lecture where it was basically all about how the purpose of the managerial task system is to set up the instructional task system. So we're not accomplishing anything instructional or learning wise using the managerial task system. That's just to create space for us to then do our instruction. And Paul and I were writing one of the very first chapters in the book, and we had a phone call, and I started talking in that way about dividing up management and instruction. And Paul said, well, let's kind of take a step back on that, because depending upon what you're talking about, when it comes to management, that can be SEL, that can align with teaching kids respect and responsibility, and social awareness and all these things that go into it. You know, I think about, you know, the after school program that we ran in Alabama when we were trying to teach kids about how to, you know, wait their turn and take their time. We would have them get up and practice. So everybody's sitting at the center of the gym, and there are hula hoops all around the gym that contain equipment. And every kid wants to get up and run out to hula hoop as soon as they can, as fast as they can. But we take the time to break that down and show them an example. So, you know, Susie, can you stand up, walk over to that hoop and get a ball? Show us what it looks like to do it the right way. And then if they make a mistake, we just bring it back, reset, and we go again. And so we're practicing that. We're showing them exemplars. We're making that part of the instructional process. And if we're making it part of the instructional process, then there are learning outcomes, or there can be. And so that experience, that conversation in the process of writing this book really just made me rethink the way that we categorize and divide instruction and management and physical education.
Yeah, I think I love that example. I just want to jump in of it. So let's dissect that moment of, you know, Susie and the hula hoop. So in taking time and doing that intentionally, that's how you could connect the dots and say you're teaching kids self-awareness, because all this is good, happy energy, right? I mean, the way you would talk to 6 and 7-year-olds about this is, I love your energy, I love your enthusiasm, but we also have to make sure everybody's safe, and that's why we're doing it this way. So you're working on awareness of their energy level and how they're feeling. You're working on self-management, because even though they've got real high energy right now, they have to also make responsible decisions about keeping it safe so we don't trample each other. We right there in that tiny little moment, we've had teachable moments for self-awareness, self-management, and responsible decision-making. And that's part of, again, I just keep using that term, mindset. A lot of this stuff is right there at our fingertips, and we have all these teachable moments. It's not time in between doing PE stuff. It's part of it, right? This is part of what we're meant to teach. And even though we're not in gameplay, or the kids aren't in MVPA at that moment, doesn't mean we're not getting to the PE yet. This is how we can, in an authentic way, integrate those things and teach them.
But think about the challenges of this, though. And this is where my other research area focused on teacher socialization really comes in. That moment that I had where I was like, shoot, this is not a division. These things integrate. They can work together. It's not management or instruction. But that was because of how I was set up, how I was socialized to view those things. And I think a lot of us in the field have that challenge when it comes to SEL, especially those of us who are socialized in environments that really emphasized getting high levels of moderate to vigorous physical activity. It can feel counterintuitive to focus on touchy-feely things that take away from the time that kids have to accrue those physical activity minutes. So part of it, I think, comes down to the socialization and how we've come to view social and emotional learning as part of physical education. Oftentimes, you know, we hear those sayings like sport builds character, and it's like, yeah, that's all good and fine, but sport only builds character if the way that you teach that sport is intentional to build character. So then building character has to matter to you. And if it doesn't matter to you, then it's not going to magically happen.
Again, if anyone wants to jump in, ask questions, have some comments, please feel free to unmute, jump on in, write in the chat as well. I really feel like, especially for those pre-service teachers, right? We talked about that affective domain. This is so abstract. And so then that breaking it down and even separating a lot of the things that you were talking about, Kevin, even the hula hoop example, I feel like, oh, that's classroom management, right? Not everyone just runs, it's classroom management, but yet being intentional and breaking out that these are actually components of SEL is very, you know, an aha moment, I think for me as well.
Yeah, and I would say, like, really good teachers are doing this stuff left and right. I mean, I really want to validate and reinforce that I don't think somebody can be a really good teacher if they're not addressing these things and managing them well. I think the difference is in our field and the mindset we're used to is we're not as intentional as we could be. That they're really take advantage of those teachable moments, right? They are coaching kids and giving feedback and developing them. This is not new stuff in that way. But I think, again, what's new is like what you said with your aha moment, and is to actually think about it intentionally. So that the teacher, when they're planning out that day, actually says, yeah, and here's where we're going to work on management. And that's where I'm hitting the affective goals for the day, or the SEL objectives for the day. If we have sort of a shared framework, a shared understanding, similar vocabulary, and an intentional approach that fits the way we teach other skills, I think all this good work that now happens sort of sporadically or in the in-between spaces is something that we can really claim and take a lot of pride in doing very well. I think we're this close to it as a field. A lot of individuals are already nailing it and knocking it out of the park, and I want to validate and encourage them to keep doing what they're doing. But as a field, I think we're still just this close.
I think it might have been Deb in the chat. You asked a question about assessment explicitly. So Jenna, who works with Deb at Wisconsin Lacrosse, co-authored the chapter with Paul and I on assessment. And you know, I think that you, just like anything else, if SEL is valued, if it's something that you care about, then it integrates with an intentional approach to assessment. It's just thinking about the target of assessment. So if you think about like an activity where you have students practicing their basketball layup, and they're in groups of 3. You've got one student who's practicing the layup, one student who is rebounding for them, and then the third student is standing there with a checklist and giving feedback. There's 2 levels of assessment that can potentially go on there. There's the peer assessment that goes from the student who's the observer giving feedback to the performer, so the student giving feedback to the student who's doing the layup. And then there's another level of feedback, which is me as the instructor. I can go around and then give feedback to the observer about how they're giving feedback. Are they looking for the right things? When they give their feedback, do they use like that feedback sandwich technique where they start with, you know, something to correct, give a positive, or they start with a positive, give something to correct, and then end on a positive note? Are you doing that kind of stuff? Deb dropped in Mostyn's teaching styles as well. So we have all of these different approaches that we can take and use and apply within assessment in thinking about SEL. But in the book, Paul wrote a pretty good section actually about using Mostyn's teaching styles to get at SEL. So I didn't know if you wanted to expand on that, Paul.
Yeah, I think it underscores a big part of what we're saying. We're not trying to present this as, hey, we thought of something new that nobody in PE knows about. That is not the case. If you the things that are best practices are there for a reason. So yeah, Mostyn, if you look at the original writings, they talk directly about the affective and the social components and the way those are addressed in different ways by each of the different styles. We mentioned TPSR already, but in the book, we've got a chapter on sport education and cooperative learning, adventure-based learning. The best practices, the ones that are really heavy into a student-centered approach, tend to really address these things well by different names because they emerged at different times. And this is kind of what I was saying before. We've got different frameworks and different vocabulary and different concepts. It seems like a huge jumble. That's one of the reasons we thought, hey, this CASTLE framework for our purposes really fits as a good lens to sort of take a fresh look at all of these things and say like, wow, yeah, it appears here, it appears here, it appears there. These core competencies are peppered throughout some of our best practices already. And so, yeah, we walk through all the styles in that spectrum and point out that different ones, you can be very intentional about developing certain SEL skills in any given one of those. You know, the different ones bring out different opportunities, but the whole range of them maps to this very nicely.
Yeah, and I think that just shows further kind of illuminates the importance of that intersection between content that you're teaching and teaching style that you're using. And so if you're trying to have students do an activity where they set and then work on their own goals independently, then you need to come up with a teaching style that provides them with that space and flexibility to be able to go work on their own if that's the goal. So there's that match again between style and outcomes.
Just leaving a little space here in case anyone else wants to jump in. Any other questions that we have going on here? So both of you have worked with pre-service teachers. So how would you best kind of explain social emotional learning to kind of service teachers? How can they work to implement this and find their own teaching style? Do you have any suggestions for that?
Yeah, so just a couple of thoughts come to me right away, if that's okay for me to start, Paul. One of the things right away is that it's a process, because pre-service teachers, they come into our teacher education programs with these backgrounds and biographies that often emphasize sport, that they often have motives that are connected to coaching, if not exclusively, then at least partially, for why they want to come into physical education. And they might not have had physical education experiences in their background that lead them to understand that social and emotional learning is a core part of what we do. So part of it is getting them to kind of open up to that and to experience it, which takes some time and some patience. Illustrating to them why it matters. For that reason, I think it's good to get pre-service teachers out into diverse field experiences where they can see different types of students and interact in different environments and learn that not everybody grew up like they did, and that in certain environments you might have to take different approaches because you have different contextual factors that you need to consider. But one thing that I found specifically in getting pre-service teachers to use TPSR, encouraging them to use TPSR, is that they become pretty good at kind of talking about these life skills. That they're good pretty quickly in identifying the different TPSR levels, talking about what it means to be respectful, how we can show effort, what it looks like to be self-directed, how you can help others both in the gym and at home. They get pretty good about talking about those things, and even about leading kind of micro conversations with students about those things. But where they really struggle is that intersection between physical activity content and SEL content. So when they're out there on the floor and they're doing activities, it's almost like they completely forget at first they're supposed to be integrating SEL. So you see this TPSR lesson that's heavy on TPSR in the beginning, heavy on TPSR at the end, and then virtually in the middle, there's nothing. Like it's just physical activity instruction. And then at the end, they're like, yeah, how about all that SEL stuff we did throughout that lesson? And there may have been opportunities for SEL, but they don't make it explicit. So this is what got me thinking about conceptualizing SEL competencies as skills, because pre-service teachers understand skills. When we talk about dribbling a basketball, I can break that down into 3 to 5 skill cues. And then pretty quickly, they become comfortable teaching those skill cues to each other and then to children. What I've found is when we approach SEL the same way, not only does it help the kids, because then it breaks it down for them, like Paul was saying before, and makes it very explicit. You can explain what it means to be cooperative rather than just saying cooperate. Same thing for the pre-service teachers. When you break it down for them and give them skill cues and talk about teaching the skills associated with SEL, then it becomes a lot more comfortable for them to integrate into their regular teaching.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I guess I would just, everything Kevin said is true generally and across time, right? And how we train teachers. That's all good advice. I would just encourage everybody to think too about what we've just gone through and are still not out of with this pandemic. This has, there's a saying I like from an old dean of mine. She said, it's a lot easier to move a boulder during an earthquake. And the fact is, things have been disrupted and challenged and turned on its ear so much that this has presented a moment where a lot of PE teachers, pre-service, in-service, veterans, had everything stripped down to most of the stuff you think of as PE and that you spend most of your time doing has just been taken away. What are you going to focus on? And SEL wound up becoming a major go-to and a major focus, not just because it was an aspect of what we're supposed to be doing anyway that was possible to deliver, but it's what kids needed the most. I mean, kids are struggling with depression, anxiety, isolation, being aware of their emotions, being able to manage their emotions. We have just been going through a period of time that really emphasized the importance in real life. I mean, how many kids really are, I mean, except for the ones that make it into the NBA, most people's jobs don't rely on their jump shot. Most people's relationships don't rely on their psychomotor skills. But these things are just so relevant, and that's really been amplified, the need for this and the relevance of it. So I would encourage, and our pre-service teachers too, they've been struggling, they've been disconnected, they've been sad, they've been having a hard time figuring out how to stay motivated. They've needed a break, they've needed time. So it has made it so real for everybody that Kevin and I, in real time, have been trying to do this, and I imagine a lot of other teacher educators have too, is to use this shared experience, this shared challenge to help them see. And, your kids are going to have these kinds of struggles too. I know you can relate to this. We all just went through this, and these are ways you can be addressing those skills and creating space for conversations like that. It just got a lot more real, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Absolutely. Do you see, I know, Paul, you've done some research on the transfer of social emotional skills in a Phi-Ed setting to maybe other settings within the school or at home in the community. Do you see this as an opportunity for our field of physical education to maybe remove some of that stigmatism and some of that marginalization that we potentially have as a field to put us more at the forefront here with social emotional learning?
Yeah, I mean, I think springing off of what I just said, the awareness and relevance of this has just been highlighted even more than it was already. We know it's a major trend in the field of education, but I always give the example of, in most, I think the majority of states now have adopted the Castle framework or something similar. And those that haven't adopted that one, I'm sure have something on the books. But let's just say you're in a school, in a district, in a state that has social emotional learning standards of some kind. I think most superintendents and most principals would be pretty hard pressed if they had someone come to do a site visit and say, okay, I'd like to see how you guys teach SEL. What does that look like? Where is it happening? I'd like to see a teacher that actually has built that into their lessons or the current unit. I'd love to see how they're assessing kids, how we're tracking kids' growth. As I said before, PE is this close. That's not a bad thing. That's a great opportunity. We are this close to being the best place in the school environment to take that tour, to say, here's what it looks like. Here's how we actually build it into the curriculum and blend it with content and give feedback in formative ways and help kids grow and develop with it. This is where it really is integrated and explicit. We're this close. I'm not trying to knock math and science and foreign language instruction, but generally they're a heck of a lot farther. I mean, think how good we are at what we do with managing an active, interactive, social, emotionally charged setting with tons of interaction throughout every lesson. Well, that's what we do anyway. So I think it could be a great point of advocacy.
Yeah, the advocacy piece is I think a really important one. Many schools have some kind of school-wide mission that promotes, that connects or promotes social and emotional learning in their with their children. When I was down in Alabama, we worked with a school that used this lighthouse leadership model, and they had these posters that kind of brought back to all these different types of leadership and the way that you can show leadership spread all around the school. And then we start talking about a lot of those same things in the gym, and then that links back. So we're connecting to this larger school mission. I did some research a few years ago as well, where we talked to teachers who had started using TPSR. And one of the things that came to the surface for them was, hey, this has made me more relevant now, because they're talking about all of this stuff at the school level. And now my principal is seeing that I'm talking about similar things in my classroom. So now I can connect to that larger school-wide mission. And suddenly now my principal sees me as an ally. Jay, I saw Jay's hand up a few minutes ago.
Thanks, Kevin and Paul. First of all, thanks very much for your awesome book. And I'm curious what you think the role of state and national organizations are in supporting this. And perhaps I think Shape America is considering rewriting the standards and the content standards for physical education. How would you feel if an SEL related standard became standard number 1 instead of it being related to psychomotor skills? And I say that because I think the vast majority of outcomes, or if you were to look at a K-12 scope and sequencing of what we usually think of as the meat and potatoes in PE, what if we could alter that and have standard number 1 be more SEL related? How would you feel about that?
Well, I'll say this. The cheeky response is I wouldn't mind it. But really, I think one thing what I would like, instead of it having be a hierarchy, a list, I honestly think it would be better if it was presented as, you know, a wheel or something like that for one thing, because I think that reinforces the message of integration, because again, kids are thinking and interacting as they're moving. You know, it's sort of artificial the way we separate these things out anyway. The better the instruction is, the more it's integrated. So I guess I would make that sense, but I think it should definitely be at the table and given absolutely equal footing. I would be satisfied with that if it really had an equal footing and people recognize that you can't address the cognitive and the affective and the psychomotor in isolation. In reality, they're all blending together. They're all working together. The better you address any one of them, it's probably pulling up the others. Just one quick example, though. These things do happen. I work with a guy who runs a tiny school for kids who have basically been kicked out of other schools. And I asked him what his approach if they use SEL there. And he says, that's our curriculum. He said, SEL is our curriculum. If we can get some math in there too, you know, and some basketball, great. But those things are the extras. In his world, SEL is number 1. That's the core thing. And as much as you can address other content, you do it. So there's all different ways to approach it. And depending on the kid's needs, you do need to emphasize that stuff more and more. I'm totally fine with that.
Yeah, so Jay, related to the other part of your question about national organizations, I think that whether that be at the state level or the national level, I'll borrow the old term from NASB, where they used to say that NASB sets the standards with the national standards. I think that there's some legitimacy to that in terms of our state and national standard, our state and national organizations kind of setting the bar with what they choose to promote in the model or the version of physical education that they get behind. I think that over the last several years, especially since Stephanie Morris has taken over as CEO of Shape America, they've had a really strong SEL push. And they've worked at becoming more inclusive and at recognizing different types of students and those students' unique experiences in physical education, which I think dovetails quite nicely with SEL as well. So in that respect, I think that the first role of professional organizations is to kind of chart the course, and then I think that another kind of related role is to help people who want to get on board go in that direction. Because remember, for better or for worse, nothing that the state or national associations put out have really any teeth. These are all guidelines and recommendations. Our national standards even are not, they don't have any teeth. They do in some respects at the state level when they're adopted, but even there, implementation and adherence varies widely. So really, I think it's about getting people on board. It's about helping people to understand the course that you've charted, and then to give them the tools to move in that direction, if they want to. Things like books, I think, help in that respect. But then other things, of course, like presentations at conferences like this one, and at national conference for Shape America, active demonstration sessions, things to give people a chance to kind of get in there and try it out, help a lot. I know for a long time, Don Hellison hosted a crash course in TPSR, and then I think that's since been transferred over to some folks at Adelphi, if I remember right. So that's kind of still happening. So, there are these ways that folks can kind of get the information and reskill, but I think that it's really it takes kind of two pieces there. It takes people wanting to do things differently and wanting to change, wanting to get on board, and then professional organizations doing a good job of developing and marketing those resources so that they're accessible for people.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I also want to acknowledge Katie's contribution in the chat that, yes, many administrators probably don't realize the amount of SEL that is taught and implemented within physical education. And again, I think I go back to Deb's question and comment how assessment can actually, assist in that. When you're assessing, you can quantify, and here we go, here's the growth. Here I can actually show this, because at least in my experience, administrators, do look at the numbers. They can look at assessments and say, okay, this is where it's going. So I absolutely agree with that. Before we're getting close to our time here, this has been very informative. I kind of want to hear both of your, and if you still have a question, please feel free to unmute and ask or write it in the chat. What do you think the next steps are for social emotional learning, especially in physical education? I mean, we've kind of hit on this with our advocacy piece and our assessment piece. But where do you see social emotional learning going in PE?
I think it's already, I know this is from the research world, but I think it's pretty telling. Like, just in the last year, there have been review articles, reviewing the literature on, there's been one focused on social emotional learning, all the research that's been done to show what PE can do in that regard. There's been another one on the affective outcomes of PE. There's been another one on personal and social skills that we develop in PE. And remember, each one of those articles reviews several dozen studies done in recent years. And I think that that's sort of the direction we're going, is people are going to keep looking at the research, the best practice, the core of what we do, and hopefully looking at it with fresh eyes, so where they can claim the things that we do really well. And to me, SEL is just the right size umbrella to catch a lot of those other good things, so that instead of it being a hodgepodge and a random assortment of things that we claim, that becomes a very coherent, well-defined umbrella that can capture a lot of different ideas and practices and outcomes. I think it's going to keep proving very useful as a framework. Getting it to translate into practice, that gets into things like socialization and changing the culture of PE and people's mindsets. That's a longer, harder road to say, we're going to get everybody on singing from the same choir book, and that's not the goal necessarily. But I do think as we start using a more common framework, using it as part of our mindset and our advocacy, I think people are going to find it very effective, and the momentum will keep building. That's my hope, but also what I think is going to happen. How far we go and how fast that moves, I can't control, but I do think that is a good direction for us.
So I guess for me, I thought about this a bit while Paul was talking. So thank you, Paul, for going first. But for me, I guess there are kind of two things that I'd like to touch on. So first is that I feel as if, especially, as Paul articulated before, coming through this pandemic, we're seeing this kind of rising tide in awareness surrounding the importance of social and emotional learning, not only in physical education, but really in education writ large. And I think that we need to not lose that tide. And we need to keep that moving forward through things like amending the national standards so that SEL has a more prominent role in the language, like you alluded to previously, Jay. Doing things like that helps to kind of take this tide that's been rising and institutionalize it. One of the things that concerns me about our profession, and this goes a little bit beyond this individual conversation, is that at times I feel like we kind of bandwagon jump from thing to thing. First it was academics and physical activity, and then physical activity and health and physical activity and SEL. We kind of hitch our wagons to a lot of different horses. And I think that the challenge there is that anytime we kind of get started down one path, we abandon it and go towards a different path. And so if this is a path that we're going to take and that we feel is meaningful for our kids in the future of our profession, then I think that being able to harness that potential that we have right now, as we've seen this tide rising, becomes incredibly important, and not losing it. The second thing relates to the point that Paul made about translation into practice. I think that also there's a lot of really cool ideas that are talked among among intellectuals and academics that don't really make it out into practice in a meaningful way. I mean, even take models-based practice, for example. Models-based practice is something that we've been harping in physical education for decades now. I've been in a lot of schools where I don't see anything that even remotely resembles models-based practice. And I'm not trying to criticize, I'm just drawing the point that we can talk about all these things in our ivory towers of higher education, those of us like myself who live there. But if it never makes it down into practice in a meaningful way, then it's really just academic navel gazing. So how do we get out of our towers and bring this out into schools? And I think in one way to do that, among others, is us getting out there and doing it. And in partnering with teachers, partnering with schools, running after school programs, going in and running physical education programs, doing work over the summer, showing people how it can be done, and taking ownership of that need to translate, ourselves as academics.
Whew, that is wonderful. I'm ready to go. Who's with me, right? Well, I just wanted to thank you. We're here nearing our time, end of our time together. So I wanted to thank again Dr. Paul Wright and Dr. Kevin Richards for joining us today in our best practices conference, talking about social and emotional learning and physical education. Paul, if you want to hold up that book again, little plug.
Hold up this book, and I'll use one thing. Kevin was talking about how the university folks can collaborate with teachers and practitioners. For those of you who aren't zoomed out by Thursday and Friday, the TPSR Alliance is hosting a free virtual conference where it's going to be focused on the TPSR model, but all of these things we've discussed today are in play, and it's a chance for us to share a lot of best practices happening on the ground, developed by coaches, youth workers, and teachers actually trying to put this into practice in youth